She found him bleeding out in a parking structure on Wentworth Avenue, his white suit the color of something that used to be expensive, his hand steady enough to point a gun at her chest despite the fact that he was, by every clinical measure she knew, 3 minutes from dead. The rain had been coming down hard for 6 hours straight, the kind of November rain that turned Chicago asphalt into a mirror and soaked through hospital scrubs like they were tissue paper. Kendra Okafor walked with her head down, her stethoscope still looped around her neck, her badge still clipped to her chest because she hadn't had the energy to take it off. The parking structure on Wentworth was 2 blocks shorter than the well-lit route. She'd taken it 100 times. Nothing ever happened on Wentworth. The dashboard clock on the hospital break room TV had read 12:47 a.m. when she finally clocked out. She'd been on her feet since 10 the previous morning. 14 hours and 23 minutes, not that she was counting. She was always counting. She'd come to Chicago from the South Side with a nursing degree, a student loan balance that made her chest hurt when she thought about it too directly, and a promise she'd made to her mother that she would do something that mattered. 2 years into the job, she was doing something that mattered every single day. She just hadn't expected mattered asterisk to feel so much like invisible asterisk. Her sneakers were wet through by the time she reached the parking structure entrance. The fluorescent light at the second level had been out for 3 weeks. Facilities had been notified. Facilities had other priorities. Kendra moved through the dark with the particular efficiency of a woman who had learned not to waste motion. Bag on her left shoulder. Keys already in her right hand. Phone in her scrub pocket. Volume on in case the hospital called. They always called. She was halfway to her car when she heard it. Not a sound she could name immediately. Something low and wrong. The kind of sound that didn't belong in an empty structure at 1 in the morning. Her feet slowed before her brain caught up. In 14 months on the cardiac floor, she had learned to hear the difference between normal and not normal before she could articulate why. Her attending called it clinical intuition. Kendra called it paying attention when everyone else had stopped. She turned toward the sound. The black luxury car was parked at an angle that suggested it had arrived in a hurry, its door hanging open, the interior light casting a pale wedge across the concrete. And there, leaning against the open door like the car was the only thing keeping him vertical, him. White suit jacket destroyed. Blood across the chest, the sleeves, the lapel, soaked through to skin. Short black hair plastered dark and wet against his forehead. A face that would have been composed under different circumstances. Sharp jaw set. Expression held together by something that was not quite strength anymore but was refusing to be anything else. He was an East Asian man, late 30s maybe, and he had the particular bearing of someone who was accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room. He was also, without question, dying. Kendra's eyes went to the wound first, entry point below the left clavicle, the spread of blood consistent with a compromised subclavian, the shallow, rapid breathing of a man whose body was making decisions his mind hadn't approved yet. She cataloged all of it in under 4 seconds. Old habit. Necessary habit. Then she saw the gun. His hand was trembling. Not much. Just enough to tell her what it had cost him to raise it. The barrel was pointed at the center of her chest, and his dark eyes, glassy with pain but still present, still watching, tracked her without blinking. Walk away. His voice was low and accented and left no room for discussion. Korean, she thought, the consonants landing like something carved rather than spoken. Walk away, he said again, now. Kendra looked at the gun, looked at the blood, looked at the rate of his breathing, too fast, too shallow, the body's last argument before it starts losing. She set her bag down on the concrete, unzipped the front pocket, pulled out her gloves. You've got maybe 40 minutes, she said, her voice coming out steadier than she had any right to expect. Probably less. That bullet is sitting somewhere it shouldn't be, and your pressure is dropping. I can hear it in your breathing. She snapped the first glove on. So you can shoot me, or you can let me help you. but you need to decide fast because I'm already running out of time and you're already out of it." The gun didn't lower, not yet. But his eyes changed. And Kendra Okafor, who had spent 14 months being the most capable and least noticed person in every room she walked into, held his gaze and did not move. Subscribe and stay with us, because this is the night Kendra Okafor stopped being invisible, and the man who would make sure of it doesn't yet know her name. The shift had started the way they all started, with someone else's emergency and no time for her own. Kendra had taken the double because Marcus called out again, and because the charge nurse looked at her the way people always looked at her when they needed something done and needed someone dependable to do it. She hadn't said no. She never said no. That was the thing about being reliable. It became its own kind of trap, a cage built out of everyone else's confidence in you. 14 hours. 4 codes. One family she'd held together in a waiting room with nothing but steady hands and honest words while a surgeon delivered news that rearranged their world. She hadn't eaten since the vending machine crackers at 6, hadn't sat down for longer than 12 minutes at a stretch, and somewhere around hour 11, her left foot had developed an ache that radiated up to her knee like a quiet, persistent complaint she had no time to address. The hospital was the kind of place that consumed people slowly, not dramatically. There were no single breaking moments, no climactic collapse, just the steady erosion of a woman who gave more than was ever given back, shift after shift, until she looked in the break room mirror one Tuesday and didn't immediately recognize the exhaustion in her own face. She was good at the job. That was the unspoken problem. Being good meant being needed. Being needed meant never being done. She'd clocked out at 12:47, signed the last chart, nodded at the night supervisor who was already looking past her toward the next thing, and walked out into the rain without bothering to pull up her hood. The cold was almost a relief, something that asked nothing from her. Wentworth was 2 blocks shorter. She'd walked it so many times the route lived in her feet rather than her head left at the corner, into the structure, up to the 2nd level, 4th space from the elevator. Automatic. Safe enough she'd always told herself to walk alone. She was thinking about nothing. That was the truth of it. Not about the family in the waiting room, not about the loan payment scheduled for Friday, not about the birthday call she still hadn't returned from her mother. Just the rain and the ache in her foot, and the particular quiet of a city that never fully slept but sometimes, briefly, breathed. That was when she heard it. Low, wet, the specific labor of lungs working harder than they should. She stopped before she understood why. Her body knew the sound before her mind named it, the same way it knew, on the floor, when something was about to go wrong before the monitors said so. She turned. The black car, the open door, the ruined white suit soaked through with blood that had been spreading for long enough to mean something serious. And the gun, pointed at her chest, held by a man who was using the last of everything he had to keep it there. She had 3 seconds to decide. She used one. The gun didn't frighten her the way it should have. That was the part she would turn over later, in the quiet of her apartment when there was finally time to be afraid. In the moment, standing 6 feet from a dying man in a destroyed parking structure at 1 in the morning, what she felt was not fear. It was the same compression of focus that hit her when a patient coded, the world narrowing to exactly what was in front of her and exactly what needed to happen next. He spoke first. Leave. The word landed flat and final, shaped by an accent that made it sound less like a request and more like a verdict. His jaw was clenched against the pain, the tendons in his neck visible with the effort of holding himself upright. You didn't see this. Walk away now. Kendra pulled on her second glove. Your left lung is compromised. She kept her voice the same way she kept it during codes, level, factual. Stripped of anything that could be mistaken for panic. The way you're breathing, shallow and fast, compensating on the right side. That bullet is sitting somewhere between your clavicle and your chest cavity, and if it's nicked the subclavian artery, you're not bleeding slowly. She took one step toward him. The gun tracked her. She didn't stop. You have 40 minutes, maybe less, so you can shoot me or you can let me help you. But you need to decide now, because I'm not leaving, and you're running out of time to be stubborn about it. Something moved behind his eyes, not softness, nothing as simple as that, more like the moment a calculation completes. The gun lowered 3 inches. She was beside him before it dropped another 2. Getting him to her car was not graceful. He was tall, solid in the way of a man whose body had been maintained like an instrument, and he was working with one arm and sheer refusal where strength had run out. She took his weight against her left side, her stethoscope pressing between them, her sneakers scraping for purchase on the wet concrete. He didn't ask for help. He didn't thank her. He simply allowed it, which she understood from certain kinds of men was the same thing. She had him in the passenger seat with his head against the rest inside of 4 minutes. She counted. He lost consciousness before she reached the structure exit. "Stay with me." She said it the same way she said it on the floor, not pleading, not soft, just directive. A clinical instruction delivered to a body that still had the capacity to comply. "I need you conscious. Focus on my voice." He surfaced barely. She kept talking. About the route, about the rain, about nothing at all. A steady stream of sound designed to give him something to hold on to. At the first light, his breathing shifted. At the second, his hand moved and found the door handle, not to open it, just to grip something solid. She drove faster. Her apartment was 12 minutes from Wentworth on dry roads. She made it in 9. The living room floor was the only option, flat, lit, enough space to work. She got him down with the controlled desperation of someone who had moved unresponsive bodies before and knew that technique mattered more than strength. He came back to consciousness when his shoulder met the floor, a sharp sound escaping through clenched teeth that told her the nerve endings were still doing their job, which was the only good news she had so far. She didn't apologize. Apologies cost seconds. The emergency kit lived under her bathroom sink in a weathered plastic case she'd been building since her 2nd year of nursing school. Not because she'd planned for this, nothing could plan for this, but because she was the kind of person who kept things that might one day be needed. Gloves, gauze, irrigation syringe, betadine, surgical forceps, the good ones, lifted from a supply cart during her clinical rotation by a version of herself that had known somehow that they would matter later. And the suture thread, expired by 14 months. She'd looked at it 3 times in the last year, thought about throwing it out and put it back. She cut away what remained of the white jacket with her trauma shears, then the shirt beneath it. The wound was exactly where she'd suspected, high left chest, the entry point clean, the surrounding tissue already darkening with the bruise of deep impact. No exit. The bullet was still inside him, which meant it hadn't hit the artery cleanly, which meant he had more time than she'd given him credit for in the parking structure. Small mercies. She poured vodka over the forceps, irrigated the wound, heard him pull a breath through his nose and hold it. "Don't," she said without looking up. "Breathe normally. Holding it makes the muscle contract." He breathed. She had done this in simulation. In skills labs with plastic torsos that didn't sweat or bleed or grip the floor with white-knuckled hands. She had done it once partially, on a trauma patient who coded before she could finish, and whose face she still saw sometimes at the edges of sleep. She thought about him now, about the one she hadn't been fast enough for, skilled enough for, equipped enough for. The woman in bed 7 last winter who rang her call button twice before anyone came. The boy, 19, who had arrived at triage with injuries that should have been survivable and hadn't survived them. You became a nurse to close the distance between what medicine could do and what it actually did for people who looked like her, loved like her, lived like her. Her mother had said that, years ago, before Kendra understood what it would cost to mean it. The forceps found resistance. She adjusted the angle, held the breath she'd told him not to hold. The bullet came free. She didn't stop moving. She moved him to the bed because the floor would drop his temperature faster than she could manage it. And hypothermia on top of blood loss on top of a wound she'd closed with expired thread was a combination she refused to negotiate with. He didn't make it easy. Semi-conscious and uncooperative in the specific way of men who had likely never learned to accept help without it costing them something. He resisted twice before his body simply stopped having the resources to argue. She got him onto the mattress, elevated his legs with the spare pillow, covered him with the heavy blanket she kept for Chicago winters, and took his temperature. 101.4. She wrote it on the notepad she kept by the bed, the one she used for grocery lists and rent calculations, now repurposed into a makeshift chart. Time, temp, respiratory rate, the small, essential language of a body she had taken temporary custody of. She pulled her chair to the bedside and sat. The fever climbed through the first hour the way fevers did, quietly, incrementally, the body's argument with itself made visible in the flush across his cheekbones and the way his breathing changed register. 102.1. She cooled the cloth, pressed it to his forehead, watched his brow contract at the contact even in sleep. She administered the last of her ibuprofen, checked the sutures, counted his respirations against her watch. He began speaking around 3 a.m. Korean mostly. The cadence of it was clipped and deliberate even in delirium, the words arriving with the rhythm of someone accustomed to giving instructions that were followed without question. Occasionally a name surfaced, Jun-seo asterisk, repeated twice, weighted with something that sounded like either grief or command. Once, a single phrase she couldn't parse but whose tone she recognized across every language barrier. An apology. The specific shape of words that meant I should have done something differently. Then, just before 4, in English so quiet she almost missed it, don't let them in. She didn't know who he meant, she noted it anyway. By 4:30 the fever had plateaued at 102.8 and she had stopped writing things down. She was just watching him, the rise and fall of his chest. The way the tension in his face had softened fractionally as the worst of the fever peaked, something beneath the control becoming briefly visible, not weakness exactly, but the outline of a person who existed underneath whatever he had spent years building on top of himself. The realization arrived without announcement. She had stopped monitoring a patient and started watching over someone. The distinction was small and enormous, and she felt it land in her chest with the particular weight of things that couldn't be taken back. She knew how to manage a patient's crisis without being touched by it. That was the skill. That was the necessary distance that made the work survivable. Somewhere in the last 4 hours, the distance had closed. She looked at her notepad, looked at him. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The silence it left behind was the loudest thing in the room. The fever broke at 6:11 a.m. She knew the exact time because she was still watching when it happened, the almost imperceptible shift in his breathing, the easing of the furrow between his brows, the way his body released something it had been braced against all night. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. The heat was receding, not gone, but retreating to somewhere manageable. Kendra sat back in her chair and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since Wentworth Avenue. She should sleep. She knew that with the same clinical certainty she knew everything else about her own body's limits. She was past the threshold where fatigue became a liability, where the mind started making small errors that added up to large ones. She knew it and she stayed in the chair anyway, because she had never once in her professional life left a critical patient's bedside before she was certain the crisis had passed, and she was not going to start in her own bedroom. He opened his eyes at 6:24. No disorientation, no slow surfacing through confusion the way most patients came back from high fever. His gaze went to the ceiling first, then made a single, deliberate arc around the room, cataloging exits and details with an efficiency that had nothing to do with clinical recovery and everything to do with habit. Then it settled on her. She met it without flinching. By now she was used to his eyes. "Your fever broke," she said. "Sutures are holding. You lost significant blood, so don't try to sit up quickly or we'll be starting over." She paused. "How's your pain?" A beat of silence, manageable. Which meant considerable. She translated and filed it away. She poured water from the glass on the nightstand and held it out. He looked at it for a moment, not suspicion exactly, something more like the unfamiliarity of being handed something without conditions, then took it. He drank slowly, deliberately, like a man relearning which parts of himself still worked. "Who shot you?" she asked. Direct, the way she asked families hard questions, not unkindly, but without the softening that wasted everyone's time. His eyes returned to her. "That isn't a safe question for you to know the answer to. I have a bullet in a bowl on my kitchen counter that came out of your chest. I'm already not safe." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite the beginning of a smile, more like the place a smile might eventually come from, if enough time passed. He considered her with the focused attention of someone unaccustomed to being surprised and recalibrating in real time. "Min-Jae," he said finally. "My name is Kwon Min-Jae." He offered nothing else, but the name was chosen, she understood, deliberate. From a man who clearly operated on a strict economy of disclosure, a name was not nothing. Kendra nodded slowly. Outside her window, Chicago was deciding to become morning. The light coming through the blinds was pale and specific, and fell across the foot of the bed between them like a boundary neither of them had agreed to yet. "Kendra," she said, "you're in Pilsen, and you owe me an explanation, Mr. Kwon, when you're ready." He said nothing, but he didn't look away. He slept again before she could press him further, which was the body's prerogative, and she respected it even when it frustrated her. Kendra moved to the kitchen, made coffee with the automatic motions of someone running on the last reserves of a second wind, leaned against the counter, and looked at the bullet sitting in the ceramic bowl beside her dish rack. Small, unremarkable, the kind of object that should not exist in a Pilsen apartment alongside her potted basil and her mother's recipe cards. She drank her coffee and didn't let herself think too hard about what she had done. Thinking too hard about it was a luxury for later, when he was stable enough for her to afford it. His phone was on her kitchen table. She hadn't taken it from him intentionally. It had fallen from his jacket pocket when she'd cut the suit away, and she'd set it aside and forgotten it in the hours of work that followed. It was face down. She had no reason to touch it. She was not the kind of person who went through other people's things. It lit up on its own. The screen woke with a notification, visible for 3 seconds before it dimmed, long enough for her to see the name displayed above a string of Korean characters she couldn't read, long enough to see the number of missed calls stacked beneath it. 11, all from the same contact. The name on the screen was in English. Kwon Group Seoul. Kendra set down her coffee cup. She was not naive about Chicago. She had grown up on the South Side, had worked 2 years in an ER before transferring to cardiac, had treated men who arrived in trauma bays with injuries that no one asked too many questions about, and whose visitors didn't sign the guest log. She knew the city had layers that most people lived comfortably above. She had simply never been pulled beneath the surface before. She opened her laptop and typed the name into the search bar with the deliberate calm of a woman who needed information more than she needed to protect herself from it. The results loaded in under 2 seconds. Kwon Group Holding Company, legitimate face, import and export real estate development across 4 countries, a philanthropic arm with a website that looked like it had been designed specifically to be the first thing someone found when they searched. Clean, professional, expensive. She scrolled past it. The second page was less curated. A business journal article from 3 years ago. A single paragraph inside a longer piece about organized crime's expansion into American coastal cities, the language careful and lawyerly, the implication clear to anyone paying attention. A name cited once, almost in passing, as the principal figure behind Chicago's most insular and least penetrable Korean criminal network. Kwon Min-Jae. Kendra closed the laptop slowly. The click of it seemed very loud in the quiet apartment. She turned. He was standing in the bedroom doorway, one hand braced against the frame, dressed in the dark trousers that were all that remained of last night's ruin. His eyes were clear and steady and already on her face, and his expression told her he had been watching long enough to know exactly what she had just read. He didn't apologize, he didn't explain. He just waited, with the patience of a man accustomed to letting other people decide how afraid they wanted to be. Kendra looked at him for a long moment. "You should be sitting down," she said finally. "You're going to pull the sutures standing like that." Something moved through his expression that she still didn't have a name for. He came and sat at her kitchen table, and neither of them pretended after that the world outside her apartment wasn't already pressing in. The coffee was still warm when he went still. It happened the way she imagined most things happened with him, without announcement, without visible cause. One moment he was sitting across her kitchen table, both hands wrapped around the mug she'd given him, the weight of what she'd found on her laptop still occupying the space between them. The next, his head turned toward the window by a degree that looked casual and wasn't. She had learned, in 14 months on the cardiac floor, to read the specific quality of stillness that meant something was wrong. This was that stillness. "What?" she said, not a question. His eyes moved to the window, then to her front door, then back. A triangle of assessment completed in under 2 seconds. "How many units on this floor?" "6. "You know your neighbors." "Well enough." "The car across the street, dark sedan. It was there when I looked out your bedroom window 20 minutes ago." His voice was the same register it had always been, low, controlled, stripped of inflection. "It hasn't moved." Kendra didn't go to the window. She understood instinctively that moving to the window was the wrong response, and she trusted that instinct the same way she trusted every other instinct that had kept her functional through a night that should have broken her. The knock came 4 minutes later. Not her door. The apartment 2 down, Mrs. Beaumont, who was 73 and kept her television on until midnight and answered the door for anyone because she had grown up in a world where that was still a reasonable thing to do. Kendra heard the knock's particular rhythm and knew immediately it was not someone who lived in this building. Residents knocked like people. This was precise, measured, the knock of someone who did this professionally. Min-Jae was already standing. The wound didn't slow him. That was the thing she would remember later, not the speed exactly, but the totality of the shift. The man who had been sitting carefully at her table, conserving movement, managing his body with the disciplined economy of someone in significant pain, was simply gone. In his place was something else, something that moved to her door in 2 steps and put himself between her and it with a completeness that left no room for discussion. His hand found her wrist, not rough, just certain. "Back of the apartment," he said quietly. "Bedroom now." Kendra looked at his hand on her wrist, looked at the door. "This is my home," she said. "Yes," his eyes didn't leave the door, "which is why you need to move." She didn't move. What she did instead was step to the left, to the narrow table beside the entrance where she kept her keys and her hospital badge, and for the last 3 years, the small can of mace her mother had pressed into her hands the day she moved to Pilsen. She picked it up. Min-Jae looked at her. Something crossed his face that she had not seen there before, not quite surprise, not quite respect, but adjacent to both and moving in that direction. The knock didn't come again. After another minute, the particular quality of the silence outside her door changed, and she knew, without being able to explain how, that whoever it was had moved on. For now. With the specific patience of people who had other options and were simply establishing that they knew where she lived. She set the mace back on the table. Her hands were steady. She noted that with the same detachment with which she noted everything. Her hands were steady, and her ordinary life was over, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. "Sit down," she told him. "You're bleeding through the bandage." He looked down. He sat. She changed the dressing in silence, her hands moving through the familiar sequence of unwrap, assess, clean, rebandage with the efficiency of someone who had stopped needing to think about the steps. The bleeding was superficial. He'd pulled the edge of one suture, not torn it through, which meant the wound was holding better than she'd had any right to expect from expired thread and improvised conditions. She taped the last edge of gauze and didn't move away immediately, a beat too long. She felt him register it. "Sit," she said, stepping back, "properly this time." He sat. She took the chair across from him and folded her hands on the table and waited with the particular patience she reserved for conversations that needed to arrive in their own time. Min-Jae looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the fever broke, with the full, undeflected attention of a man who had decided she was worth the expenditure of it. It was not comfortable being looked at like that. It was also not nothing. "What happened at your door will happen again," he said, "more formally next time. They know you exist now." He said it without apology and without dramatization, which she appreciated more than softening would have. "I can have you relocated by tonight. New apartment covered for a year. Your hospital loans cleared within the week. You would not need to see me again or know anything further about my situation." Kendra was quiet for a moment. "That's a transaction," she said. "Yes. You're trying to pay me and disappear me at the same time." Something tightened almost imperceptibly around his eyes. "I'm trying to limit what my problem costs you." "Your problem already costs me." She said it evenly, not as accusation. "I'm the one who chose that. You don't get to retroactively make that choice smaller by writing a check." She paused. "And I don't want your money, Mr. Kwon." The silence that followed was a different quality than the ones before it. Those had been functional silences, spaces between necessary things. This one had weight. He was recalibrating again, she could see it, the subtle adjustment behind his eyes of a man who had walked into a conversation with a script and found it insufficient. "What do you want?" he asked. The question came out stripped of its usual armor, genuinely open in a way she suspected it rarely was. Kendra considered him across the table, the sharp lines of his face, still carrying the shadow of last night's ordeal. The hands that had gripped her door frame and put themselves between her and danger without hesitation. The name that meant something enormous in a world she'd known nothing about 12 hours ago. "The truth," she said, "about who came for you and why and what comes next." She held his gaze. "Not because I'm involved, because I already am, and I'd rather know what I'm standing in the middle of than be managed around it." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse. Then he said, "It was my second in command," and the words landed on the table between them like something irrevocable. The kitchen was very small. She had never noticed quite how small until this moment, with him filling the chair across from her, and the space between them reduced to 3 feet of ordinary wood, and the specific charge of 2 people who had moved past every professional and practical boundary, and arrived, without planning to, at something neither of them had a prepared response for. Kendra nodded slowly. "Then tell me the rest." And he did. He talked for 40 minutes. Not the way most people talked, filling space, circling back, softening edges. He talked the way he did everything else, with precise economy, each sentence placed deliberately, nothing offered that wasn't chosen. His second in command, a man named Park Sung-won, who had spent 3 years building loyalty inside the organization while building something else entirely underneath it. A power structure within a power structure, patient and incremental, the kind of betrayal that required more discipline than most people applied to their ambitions. The ambush had been coordinated. 4 men, 2 exits blocked, the third left open as misdirection. Min-Jae had understood what was happening within the first 30 seconds and had made it to his car on the understanding that surviving the night mattered more than responding to it. He had driven until he couldn't and stopped where he stopped, and the rest of it she already knew. Kendra listened without interrupting. She had learned a long time ago that the most valuable clinical skill was not the ability to speak. It was the ability to create enough silence that the truth could surface on its own. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Park Sung-won," she said. "Is he the one who sent someone to my door this morning?" "Yes." "And he'll send someone again?" "Yes." No hesitation, no gentling of it. "He needs to know whether I'm alive. Your address is a thread he'll pull until it tells him something." Kendra looked at her hands, flat on the table. The hands that had extracted a bullet at 2 in the morning and sutured a wound with expired thread and taken a temperature every 40 minutes through the longest night of the last several years. These hands, her ordinary, capable, invisible hands. She had spent a long time being someone who absorbed whatever the situation required and asked for nothing back. She had told herself it was strength. Sitting here now, in the particular clarity that arrived on the other side of an impossible night, she understood it had also been a way of making herself small enough not to be disappointed. If you never asked for anything, nothing could be withheld. If you never stood in the center of your own life, you couldn't be removed from it. The parking structure on Wentworth had ended that. Not Min-Jae, not the gun, not the blood, not the white suit that had cost more than her monthly salary. The choice she had made, the one that took less than 3 seconds and that she had not once in the hours since wished she could unmake. That was what had ended it. Her own decision, arrived at in the dark, with nothing to recommend it except that it was true to the person she actually was beneath the exhaustion and the careful smallness. She looked up. "I'm not relocating," she said. Min-Jae held her gaze. "Kendra." "I'm not relocating," she said again, steadier. "This is my home. I've lived here for 3 years. I know my neighbors and I know this street, and I am not going to be moved out of my own life because someone sent a man to knock on the wrong door." She paused. "I understand what that means. I understand what it costs. I'm telling you anyway." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Then Min-Jae said, "If you stay, I cannot make you invisible to this. I can put people on this building. I can ensure Park Sung-won understands that you are not a thread he is permitted to pull." His voice was measured and absolute. "But I cannot undo the fact that you exist in my world now. That is permanent. I need you to understand that before." "I understand it." She met his eyes. "Do you understand that I'm not staying because of you? I'm staying because of me. Because I'm done making myself smaller than I am." Something happened to his face then that she had not seen happen before, across all the long hours of the night. Not the controlled recalibration she'd come to recognize, not the guarded assessment. Something beneath all of that. Something that looked, stripped of everything else, like relief. The specific relief of a man who had not known he was waiting for something until it arrived. He reached across the table. Not for her hand, something more deliberate than that and more restrained. He placed his hand on the table between them, palm down, a gesture she understood without translation. Not a claim, an offering. The difference mattered enormously, and he clearly knew it. Kendra looked at his hand, at the elegant, blood-stained, dangerous hand of a man who had put himself between her and her front door on pure instinct, before he had any reason to protect her specifically. She placed her hand beside his, not touching, close enough that the space between them was a decision rather than a distance. Outside, Chicago had finished becoming morning. The light through her kitchen blinds had shifted from pale to gold, falling across the table, across the 2 coffee mugs, across the ceramic bowl that still held a bullet neither of them had mentioned in the last hour. Somewhere on her street, a delivery truck was making its rounds. A child was being walked to school. The ordinary world was proceeding with complete indifference to what had changed inside this apartment, which was, she thought, exactly how it always worked. The world didn't mark the moments that remade people. It just kept moving and left you to carry the change alone. She wasn't alone. That was the thing. For the first time in longer than she could honestly account for, she was not alone. Min-Jae looked at their hands, side by side on the table, and then looked at her with the full, unguarded attention she was slowly learning was the most dangerous thing about him. Not the organization, not the name, not the enemies who knew her address now. This, the way he looked at her like she was the first thing in years that had surprised him into honesty. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. He was still for a moment. Then, "Now I make sure you're safe." And then he paused, and what came next arrived carefully, deliberately, the way everything he said did. "And then I would like to know you, outside of this." A slight motion of his hand, indicating the apartment, the night, the blood and the bullet and the fever and the impossible compressed hours of it. "If you're willing." Kendra Okafor, who had spent her entire adult life being needed without being known, looked at the man across her kitchen table. The man she had pulled from the edge of dying, with expired thread and institutional habit, and the stubbornness of someone who had never once been able to walk away from someone who needed her. She thought about the parking structure, the 3 seconds, the choice. She had made it then, she was making it now. "Ask me something," she said, "something that has nothing to do with last night." He considered her for a long moment, and then something shifted in his expression, quiet and careful and entirely real. "What made you become a nurse?" Outside, the delivery truck moved on. The child reached the end of the block. Chicago kept going, indifferent and loud and fully itself, the way it always had. Inside the apartment on Pilsen, Kendra began to answer. And the story, the real one, the one that had nothing to do with bullets or betrayal or the specific geography of survival, finally, quietly began.